Hi everyone. In this episode, I want to preview some of the challenges unique to us scholars from the Global South. Challenges that we face in academia in general, in our workplaces, and also in our interpersonal relations within our institutions. And I said preview because I plan to talk about this in more detail in conversation with other scholars who can share with us their experiences and what they do about these challenges. Also, the dynamics and factors behind these challenges are evolving, which I hope is for the better. And what I want to share with you in this episode is more about what I felt or what I have observed as barriers to meeting our potential in academia. Scholars Unbound is a bi-monthly podcast or video series that showcases the voices of scholars who know no boundaries when it comes to the pursuit of knowledge. You will hear insights from their experiences as international scholars and how these influence their research, hoping to inspire future scholars to be fearless, global, and unbound. I'm your host, Dalia Simangan. The first one is travel restrictions. And this becomes even more pronounced when we attend events, meetings, or conferences in countries where we need to get a visa. Perhaps many of you know that a visa application is often a lengthy process. The COVID-19 restrictions further complicated this process, and it really requires time and effort to collect all the documents to prove that we are quote unquote legitimate travelers. And these documents vary from the usual letters of invitation to the ridiculous bank statements and history of travel. I also heard of cases when scholars did not get the job offered to them just because of their passports. And as for me, I remember once in the past choosing not to attend a conference because the notification of acceptance was too close to the application deadline for a visa. And that's why it's really important for conference organizers to notify their participants as early as possible so that some of us who need to apply for visas will have enough time to collect all these documents and meet the processing time. And besides the visa application, travel in itself is costly, and sometimes our institutions are unable to provide funding support to shoulder our travel expenses. And this brings me to the issue of research funding. Many institutions or universities located in the Global South, especially those in lower income countries, do not enjoy the same benefits from research funding that is usually available to institutions in higher income countries. And I don't have to elaborate the serious implications of a lack of research funds. We might have important and really novel research ideas, but if we don't have the funding to do the research, we become very limited by the time and resources we have. The lack of research funding could also limit our support and mentoring to emerging scholars or early career scholars. I'm aware that it could be so frustrating to craft a research project and plan to involve or collaborate with students and ECRs, but our budget is not enough to accommodate what we plan. That is a missed opportunity not only for collaboration but also for mentoring and capacity building of future generations of scholars. And tied to this research funding is research access. What I mean by research access here is getting hold of published work like books and articles, archives, and other materials needed for our research. And this also includes doing data collection, which again is sometimes costly and requires funding. And I'm aware that there are several ways and means to get hold of paywalled publications, but sometimes these are not as updated as their original sources, especially when looking for publications in the last year or two. And I don't think I need to elaborate on how this impacts our research work, where our limited access also limits our conversations with recent works or even historical ones, limits the timeliness of our work, and therefore limits the impact of our scholarship. The fourth challenge that I'd like to talk about here is more relevant to scholars who are living away from home or overseas. For me, I pursued my graduate studies outside the Philippines, and now I'm also working in a university outside the Philippines. Of course, there are benefits to doing this. I had an international experience. I learned how to be very independent, and now I have more courage to explore the unfamiliar. But the downside is that I'm not physically closer to my family. And in this COVID situation, even if I wanted to for the past 3 years, I simply couldn't, or there were too many risks to traveling overseas, given the COVID related restrictions. There are also feelings of homesickness and isolation for someone who needs constant social support or community belongingness. I'm fortunate that I don't feel this at all, but I recognize that these are emotions that can be detrimental to our lives, including how we work. And within our work environments, there's some challenges that we cannot shake away so easily. One of those is language barriers. Living in Japan, someone like me who doesn't know how to communicate in Japanese, I feel that there's some information not always available to me. And I know that this is quite easy to overcome. I just need to learn the language. But at the same time, for me to do this, I have to allocate time away from my regular working hours. And honestly, it's so difficult to do this at the present. But I'm hoping that I will be able to focus on this sooner than later. I know that I need to learn the language. But for the broader academia, we all know that English is the working or the language of publication. And many of us are either not well versed in English or have been, bombarded with feelings of inferiority whenever we use it. I think this has something to do with our socialization as well. In the Philippines, for example, we always proclaim that we are an English speaking country, but honestly speaking, this is a very generalizing claim and somehow ignores the fact that we do not have the same level of comfortability in using the language. Some of us went to schools that use English more often, and some of us didn't. And even in academia, I have observed how difficult it is sometimes for others to express their thoughts spontaneously in a language other than the one that they grew up using. I can already hear some disagreements with me about this, that this is more of a structural, externally imposed issue, or that it has something to do with our levels of confidence rather than skills. But I also believe that by recognizing this issue or challenge, not as a weakness, but as a unique aspect of being a scholar, we can be more kind to ourselves and to others, and also more open to improving our ways to communicate. I also want to mention here the experiences of discrimination and microaggression in academia. First of all, I'm not here to say that these experiences are unique to us scholars from the Global South, but they happen to us more often because of the long history of colonialism, oppression, and injustice embedded in this North-South divide. From belittling our work, intentionally ignoring or silencing our voices, imposing their unfair standards on us, and failing to support us in overcoming the barriers I mentioned earlier, these are all kind of residues of historical injustice. And I know that there are now more efforts to eliminate these practices in our work environments, or that, we usually call this practices affirmative action. But it's also important to somehow examine the unintended consequences of this otherwise good set of practices. Consequences like belittling again our achievements by regarding them as outcomes of affirmative action rather than merit do happen. By the way, merit in itself is born out of inequality and injustice, but that's for a different episode. And it feels so frustrating sometimes to hear this, that people don't understand these efforts are not simply handouts. They are meant to include excellent work and people that are otherwise ignored by the structures of discrimination. And this relates to misrepresenting these efforts to the point that our participation and active inclusion in academia, no matter how equally commendable our work and scholarship are, can be downplayed as tokenism, adding more burden, by the way, on Global South scholars. What I meant here is that institutions should do more than require diversity in academic outputs. Institutions must start by providing us with equal opportunities from the very beginning, so that we don't end up just being invited to add diversity to existing work led by the Global North scholars, because we can lead our own work, our own projects. And in this process, our outputs are inherently diverse and rich. The point is, diversity is not a tool or an afterthought after realizing that something lacks it. It is the goal. But if we start with diversity, then we don't need to have it as a goal anymore because it's already the situation. All this can be traced back to institutional or structural problems rather than personal, but there are things that we can do at the individual level. There are many things that we can do, but as I have mentioned in previous episodes, my call for action here for you is to promote your work. I invite you to share your achievements, share your academic engagements, your publications in any way you can on social media, within your university, or with your close peers. This is one thing we can control, to show that we are here, to claim our presence and shape our visibility, that we might have come from a certain part of the Global South, but we are global. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please consider leaving a comment or rating at iTunes or any of your preferred podcast hosting platforms. For details about upcoming episodes and how to support the Scholars Unbound project, visit daliasimangan.com/scholars unbound with the link in our show notes.